8 days before the opening match, police closed an avenue in Mexico City to stop teachers from marching on the stadium that was about to host the World Cup. 12 protesters were detained on opening day itself, 2 journalists with them. Mexico City's own Human Rights Commission was forced to open formal complaints against its own police force for actions taken in defense of a football tournament that hadn't even kicked off yet. A banner, painted by hand outside Azteca Stadium, summed up what was happening better than any press release FIFA ever produced. The World Cup passes, the dispossession remains. This was not supposed to be the story. FIFA had spent 3 years building a different one, the biggest World Cup in history, 48 teams, 3 host nations, 16 cities, a festival of unity that would bring the planet together one more time, the way it always does. And in the final 2 weeks before kickoff, that story collapsed in real time, in public, on camera, in 3 different countries simultaneously. This is the story of how the 2026 World Cup arrived already in crisis. Not because of anything that happened on the pitch, because of everything that happened around it. Let's start where the cracks first became impossible to ignore. Mexico City. President Claudia Sheinbaum had spent months insisting there was no social unrest building ahead of the tournament. No tension, no problem. Just excitement, investment, and a country ready to welcome the world. Then, with the opening ceremony days away, she had to publicly admit something different. If for some reason the Zocalo cannot be used for the opening, she told reporters, there are 18 venues where people can watch it free of charge. If for some reason, that phrase, chosen carefully by a sitting president, was an acknowledgement that the central plaza of Mexico's capital, the symbolic heart of the opening day celebrations, might not be usable. Because of protests her government had spent months insisting weren't happening, they were happening. On June 1st, 10 days before kickoff, teachers from Mexico's National Coordination of Education Workers marched toward the Zocalo under a slogan that needed no translation to understand. If there's no solution, the ball won't roll. Road closures, rerouted commutes, construction crews working through the night to finish stadium infrastructure while protest marches wound through the same streets. On June 9th, 2 days before the opening match, police shut down an entire avenue to physically prevent demonstrators from reaching Ciudad de Mexico Stadium. On June 11th, opening day itself, families from Mexico's search collectives, parents and relatives of the disappeared, marched toward the same stadium, carrying photographs of missing loved ones. Protesting a government that had found billions for stadiums and beautification projects, while their relatives remained unfound, uninvestigated, ungrieved. And the detentions that followed, 12 protesters and 2 journalists, taken into custody on the day the tournament began, were serious enough that Mexico City's own Human Rights Commission opened formal complaints against its own authorities. This is what was happening in the host city of the opening match, in the hours before Shakira walked out to perform, in the hours before 80,000 fans filled the Azteca for the ceremony FIFA had been promoting as the start of something historic. But Mexico City's protests were not really about the World Cup. That is the detail that makes this story bigger than a few angry banners outside a stadium. The protesters were explicit about it. We are not against the sporting event, one organizer told reporters. We are against excessive public spending when we are going through very serious crises. Because underneath the marches was a housing crisis the tournament had measurably accelerated. Long-term residents watching their apartments converted into short-term rentals. Airbnb, a FIFA World Cup partner, expanding rapidly across neighborhoods already strained by an influx of remote workers from wealthier countries, chasing lower costs of living. Rent climbing, eviction notices multiplying, a pattern researchers and housing advocates had been documenting for 2 years, finally erupting into the streets in the final weeks before kickoff. In Santa Ursula Coapa, the indigenous community adjacent to Azteca Stadium itself, residents have been fighting since 2021 against a real estate development tied directly to the stadium renovation. Their protest banner outside the ground captured the entire conflict in one sentence. If the water does not arrive, neither does the World Cup. And it wasn't only Mexico City. In Guadalajara, $23 million went toward rehabilitating the historic center for tournament visitors, $12 million of that to a single public square, while the state's search commission for missing persons operated on a fraction of that budget. In Monterrey, the same pattern repeated. Beautification spending, infrastructure spending, security spending, all justified by the tournament, while the underlying crises that activists had been raising for years remained exactly where they were. Amnesty International had warned, months before any of this became visible on camera, that what was coming could be the largest and most lucrative World Cup in history, paired with the kind of repressive practices that accompany mega events of this scale. Street sweeps, targeting unhoused populations, ethnic profiling, crackdowns on the right to organize and protest. The warning had been published in March. Journalists were filming exactly what the report had described. That was Mexico. But Mexico was only one part of a wider story that by the time the tournament actually kicked off, had spread across every layer of the event FIFA had built. Because while protesters were being detained outside Azteca Stadium, a different crisis was unfolding inside FIFA's own ticketing and hospitality operation. One that had been building for months, and that the organization had spent that entire time publicly defending. Between October 2025 and April 2026, FIFA raised ticket prices for more than 90 of the tournament's 104 matches by an average of 34%. Fans who had bought early, who had trusted the original pricing, who had applied through ballots in good faith, found themselves holding non-refundable tickets worth significantly less than what they paid. There was no refund mechanism. FIFA's own resale platform, which charged a 15% fee on both sides of every transaction, allowed a single World Cup final ticket to be listed at over $2 million. Category 1 final seats started at almost $11,000 on the primary market. The Attorneys General of New York and New Jersey responded with formal subpoenas, describing what fans had experienced as a gauntlet of confusion, fake scarcity, and impossibly high prices. And it wasn't just tickets. FIFA had quietly returned 70% of its block-booked hotel rooms across major host cities in the weeks before kickoff. The hotel blocks that businesses had structured entire summers around, that had informed staffing decisions and revenue forecasts across dozens of American cities, released back to the market because the demand that FIFA had spent months insisting was unprecedented simply hadn't materialized at the prices FIFA had set. Industry survey respondents from the American Hotel and Lodging Association described the wave that was supposed to arrive with a single word: non-event. European flight bookings for the tournament period were running 14% below the previous year, despite a weaker dollar that should have made the trip cheaper, not more expensive. The fans simply weren't coming in the numbers FIFA had promised. And for some teams, the question wasn't whether fans could afford to come, it was whether they were allowed to. 4 qualified nations, Iran, Haiti, Kuwait, and Senegal, had supporters who could not enter the United States at all, blocked not by choice, but by travel restrictions written into the host country's own immigration policy. Iran's situation went furthest. Their original base camp in Tucson, Arizona, had to be abandoned entirely after the U.S. government refused to allow the squad to stay overnight on American soil. The solution, brokered between FIFA, the Iranian Federation, and the Mexican government, required Iran to base their entire tournament in Tijuana and cross the border for every single match, then return to Mexico immediately afterward. A national team crossing an international boundary before and after every fixture of the biggest tournament of their lives, while every other nation at the World Cup trained and rested without ever leaving their host city. FIFA's own selected referee for the tournament, Omar Abdelkadir Artan of Somalia, named the best referee in Africa for 2025, was detained at Miami International Airport and questioned for 11 hours before being denied entry and sent home. Fans from 75 countries faced halted visa processing in the months leading up to the tournament, with uncertainty about timelines that made planning a trip to the World Cup, for many supporters, simply impossible. When FIFA's president was asked directly about the situation, about a World Cup official selected by his own organization being turned away at the border, his response was 5 words: "We are not involved." That phrase did not apply only to the referee. It applied to almost everything that was unfolding around this tournament in its final weeks. FIFA set the prices, FIFA chose the hosts, FIFA built the resale platform, FIFA returned the hotel blocks, FIFA selected the referee who was turned away. And on every single one of those outcomes, the organization's position was the same 5 words: "We are not involved." Back in the Netherlands, a petition with 174,000 signatures had been formally presented to Parliament, asking the national team to stay home entirely. Germany's Football Federation held formal executive meetings to discuss a possible boycott, with a sitting vice president publicly invoking the 1980 Moscow Olympics as a point of comparison. Former FIFA president Sepp Blatter went public urging fans to avoid the United States altogether. A Facebook group dedicated to boycotting the tournament gathered 25,000 members. None of these movements succeeded in keeping a single qualified federation home. FIFA's own statutes, with fines and suspensions attached to politically motivated withdrawal, made that outcome almost structurally impossible. But the fact that the conversation happened at all, at this scale, across this many countries, in the weeks immediately before kickoff, was itself the story. Not a boycott, a reckoning. Federations, fans, and journalists across multiple continents independently arriving at the same uncomfortable question. What does it actually cost to host the World Cup? And who is being asked to pay that cost? Because by the time the opening whistle blew in Mexico City, the pattern connecting all of it was no longer difficult to see. A government in Mexico that had spent billions on stadium infrastructure and urban beautification, while families searching for missing relatives marched in the same streets, demanding to be seen. A ticketing system that priced out the supporters who wanted to be there most, while leaving stadium sections and luxury suites empty enough to require an emergency price cut just weeks before kickoff. A host country whose own immigration policy blocked entire national fan bases, entire base camps, and even FIFA's own selected match officials from entering freely. And a governing body that, confronted with every one of these outcomes, repeated the same explanation each time. Not our decision, not our department, not involved. What makes this different from previous World Cups is not that problems exist. Every host nation has faced criticism. Every tournament has produced some version of this conversation. What makes 2026 different is the scale and the simultaneity. Protests in 3 Mexican host cities at once. A pricing scandal serious enough to draw formal subpoenas from 2 U.S. states. A travel restriction so severe it forced an entire national team to relocate their tournament base across an international border. A referee turned away at the airport on the eve of the opening match. All of it happening together in the same 2-week window before a single ball had been kicked in anger. FIFA built a tournament on the promise of unity, scale, and unprecedented global welcome. What arrived instead, in the final days before kickoff, was a series of fractures running simultaneously through housing policy, immigration law, ticketing economics, and basic questions of who this event was actually designed to serve. The football, when it finally started, was extraordinary. It usually is. The Azteca was full. The atmosphere was real. Mexico equalized on opening night in front of 80,000 people who had waited their entire lives for that moment. But outside the stadium, in the same hours, in the same city, families were marching with photographs of the missing. 12 protesters were sitting in detention. A human rights commission was opening formal complaints, and a banner, painted in hand-lettered Spanish, was still standing outside Azteca Stadium, saying the thing FIFA never quite found a way to say itself. The World Cup passes. The dispossession remains. What do you think? Are these crises simply the unavoidable cost of hosting an event this size? Or did FIFA's own decisions on pricing, on host selection, on accountability make this outcome inevitable before a single match was played? Leave it in the comments. These are the conversations this channel exists for.